time.
Hey, how are you, sir?
I'm very well.
Finally. You thought you might not want to make it to this one?
Yeah, I just finished work tonight.
Okay, I'll do that. Thanks so much for making it.
I'm really pleased. I think this one's recording.
Oh, there we go. There's the man himself. So let me throw him in.
Too bad. We all bought our copies for the son.
Oh, yeah. Put that right there.
I'm hoping to go to visit, if I can arrange to visit.
Oh, you are?
Yeah.
Wow.
On behalf of Cordoba Foundation, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this evening's seminar on the Islamic State governance and power sharing amid a changing international climate, with special reference to the political thought of Sheikh Rashid Ghanouchi. This event is being organized by the Cordoba Foundation and supported by Middle East Monitor, of which I am the director. And over the years, we have worked very closely and have achieved very fruitful results from our collaboration. Tonight is no exception. We are happy and very honored to be supporting this event. The CEO of the Cordoba Foundation, Dr. Anas Atikriti, is unable to be with us tonight, but we are happy that his colleague and the managing director of the Cordoba Foundation, Dr. Abdullah Thalib, is here with us. Let me Professor Andrew March, who is a professor at Massachusetts University in political science, and our dear friend and colleague, Dr. Ahmad Galul, who is an advisor to Sheikh Rashid and also a lecturer in Islamic affairs. To you, our audience, again, we are very grateful and happy that you are able to join us for what promises to be a very fruitful and engaging evening. The venue, the LMC, is, for those of you who do not know, and the East London Mosque was founded in 1910. It is the oldest mosque in the United Kingdom, and this center and mosque complex is the largest in Europe. You can find about 8,000 people praying here in any of the congregational prayers. Sheikh Rashid has conducted many classes and lectures here in this center, and we are pleased to be able to discuss his work tonight as he faces ongoing persecution at the hands of the regime in Tunisia. The Cordoba Foundation was founded in 2006. It's an independent public relations, research and policy making think tank. It engages primarily in intercultural dialogue and tries to promote a coexistence between cultures. It has been advocating for the rights of justice for the persecuted, both individuals and peoples, whether we speak of the Uyghur or the Muslims of Myanmar, or in Palestine or Syria or anywhere else. The Cordoba Foundation has worked resolutely to highlight their plight and to advocate for support for justice for them. Professor Marsh lectures in political science, as I said, and he is a very prolific writer. Some of his work, I see one on the table here, are all pertaining to Islam and Tunisia in particular. He's written The Caliphate of Man, the Invention of Popular Sovereignty in Modern Islamic Thought, published in 2019. And together with Sheikh Rashid, published in 2023, they did something called On Muslim Democracy, Essays and Dialogues. So we are very fortunate to have him to share his thoughts and the results of his collaboration with Sheikh Rashid over the years. Ahmed Galul perhaps is no stranger to many of us. He's been residing here in exile prior to the successful uprising of 2011. He's now back here in the UK with us. A few words about safety and procedures. In the event of any emergency, follow the signs. They are well posted along the corridors, and you would find a safe exit. There are toilets outside on either side of the long corridor. We aim to finish at 7:30. So the running order is that we will have Professor March first, and then we'll hear from Dr. Ahmed Galul, and a few words by the son of Sheikh Rashid, who we are happy to welcome again with us, Brother Muaz. He's here with us. And then we wrap it up after discussions and questions. So without any further delay, I know I perhaps have taken too much time. I call upon Professor Marsh to speak to you.
Well, thank you very, very much for that warm introduction. Thanks to all of you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very, very much for the invitation, for the warm welcome, for the opportunity to speak about this book that was published recently by Sheikh Rashid together with myself. I'd like to use this as an opportunity to do a few things. I'd like to introduce the book. I'd like to say what it's about, what its context is, how it relates to previous work that I wrote on modern Islamic political thought, with particular reference to Sheikh Rashid's thought. And I want to kind of open up a discussion about what some of my observations and arguments and conclusions are about the trajectory of modern Islamic political thought and its aspirations to theorize a distinct conception of legitimacy, of justice, of political order, and of democracy. What that was sort of historically before the historic revolutions of 2011, what those revolutions and the experiment with creating democracy did to parties like Ennahda in Tunisia. I want to talk a little bit about this turn from Islamic democracy to Muslim democracy, or from traditional political Islam to Muslim democracy, how I understand it, how this book contributes to that, what Dr. Galul has to say, and then hopefully this leaves a lot of time to hear some thoughts of people in the room, whether what we have to say resonates, whether it makes sense, whether it doesn't make sense, and sort of where things stand today in light of the many tragic events since at least 2013 and 14. So if I could switch. Now, I have been a Mac person for a long time. So where's our tech guy? How do I switch over to my PowerPoint? Hold on. So there was another. No, not that. So I had downloaded my PowerPoint. Is it here? No. Sorry. There it is. Got it. Can you do that again? And then this, and then slideshow there. Slideshow. From beginning. All right. How's that? All right. So first off, this is the book. The book consists of a relatively lengthy introduction by me, which has this theme. So, as we all know, let me begin here. In 2016, 2 years after Tunisia adopted a democratic constitution that was to a large extent co-written by the members of Ennahda that participated in the Constituent Assembly, and 5 years after the Jasmine Revolution, at the annual party Congress of 2016, the Ennahda party declared that they were no longer referring to themselves as an Islamist party or belonging to political Islam, but embracing something called Muslim democracy. And so that's kind of the opening point for this book and for the talk. And the question is, what is this idea of Muslim democracy? How does it differ from other ideas of the Islamic State or an Islamic Republic or an Islamic conception of democracy? What is the significance in saying, we are now Muslim Democrats and please understand us in this way? And so I, as an academic, have some of my own views, but the book is an attempt to articulate this. So I have an introduction, then there are 10 essays by Sheikh Rashid, translated more or less for the first time. I don't know if everybody can see here, but some of these are essays that were published before 2011. Some of them were lectures actually delivered, I believe, in Manchester or Birmingham, perhaps similar to lectures that he would have given here on questions of freedom, how committed Muslims should understand the problem of freedom. Is it an alien, liberal, Western, secular concept that has nothing to do with Islam, or is it something that has a place within an overall Islamic conception of morality, law, justice, political order, so on and so forth? A number of the essays grapple with the problem of opposing authoritarianism and to what extent Islamist parties should prioritize basic political freedoms, democracy, as opposed to a more comprehensive conception of an Islamic-based public order. What is the argument for grasping for even basic civil and political rights and freedoms in the face of authoritarianism, but how that also fits into an Islamic conception of political morality. A number of the essays deal with various currents within modern Islamic and Islamist political thought. So one of my favorite essays, Between Sayyid Qutb and Malik bin Nabi, is a very, very important essay because it really tracks multiple strands of influence on thinkers within the Tunisian Islamist movement. As we all know, some inspiration came from the traditional ideology of the Egyptian and Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, but Sheikh Rashid was also a very close student of the Algerian historian and political theorist Malik Benetti, who had a very different orientation. And in fact, if you read Sayyid Qutb closely, I'm not insinuating that anybody here has, you will notice that Qutb at many times refers somewhat negatively to Malik Benetti, not by name. He talks about this Algerian writer talking about civilization. And so it's a very interesting, for those of you that are curious about how Ghanouchi's thought travels between different sources of inspiration. It's a very, very important essay. He talks about various kinds of internal criticism of aspects of the Islamic movement and Islamist ideology in When is Islam the Solution?, the problems of contemporary Islamist discourse. And then a number of essays, the last three, are particularly situated in the context of the Tunisian Constitution of 2014. So it was a constitution that was to a large extent drafted by the representatives and deputies of Ennahda, but the result was not an Islamic regime. It was not an Islamic constitution. It did not have a reference to the Islamic Sharia as a source or inspiration of law. It included various things like the universality of international human rights, certain ways of talking about gender relations. And so from an Islamic standpoint, the Constitution required commentary. What is Islamic about it? Why do we accept this from an Islamic point of view? How do we understand this in terms of our values and aims and so forth? And so those last three essays are quite important, and they really deal, I think, with a lot of subtlety as well as sophistication with this transition to a distinct conception of political action that is referred to as Muslim democracy. And then about half the book is a series of dialogues between Sheikh and myself. You see here, I was looking somewhat younger. Mu'adh remembers this. I think this was the winter of 2017 and 18, as well as 18 and 19. So this was, I have to say, if you don't mind a sort of a personal comment, this was an extraordinary privilege and pleasure and honor for me. My second book that our brother mentioned, The Caliphate of Man, was in fact inspired by my encounter with Ghanouchi's book, Al-Hurriyat al-Amma fi al-Dawla al-Islamiyya, Public Freedoms in the Islamic State. I was aware of the book, of course, for many years, but I started reading it in detail shortly after the Tunisian Revolution in 2011 or 12. I was thinking I was going to write an article on Ghanouchi's thought as a legal theorist. And in fact, as I started to read this book, I quickly discovered that what was central to the book and central to his thought was this concept of the universal khilafah. That the central, and he refers to this as the central concept of Islamic political philosophy, that the people or the ummah is God's caliph on earth. And it's out of this that flows all of the conception of political legitimacy, democracy, political order, public rights and freedoms, and even what it means to think about the Sharia in public in a modern state. So I was transformed by this. And I completely rewrote my entire research project. I became fascinated with this concept of the universal caliphate. I tracked it back through modern Islamic thought, beginning with figures like Maududi, but also looking at 19th century reformist thought, especially in Tunisia, figures like Khairuddin al-Tunisi and Ahmed bin Diaf and so forth. And so this ended up being my second book, and Ghanouchi's thought was the culmination of this book. And in my mind, his thought through Public Freedoms in the Islamic State was the kind of culmination of a 20th century and 21st century project within the Islamic international public sphere of coming to terms with the idea of the modern state, with the idea of democracy, while remaining committed to certain concepts like divine sovereignty and the centrality of the Islamic Sharia. So for me, he was a historical thinker, and when you spend time, writing a book on many figures and spending so much time dealing with his thought, you become very attached to a thinker, and you develop lots of ideas, and you start to think with a political thinker. And so I had the initiative to translate this book into English, which we finally completed, I think, in 2021. So that book is available in English, and that was a great honor. And it was through that you can hold it up there. I came to be acquainted with Muaz and Sheikh's family and himself, and so this opportunity to spend many, many days with him. He was extremely generous with his time. We spent hours upon hours in his home at a time when he was extremely busy helping Beji the Sebsi run the country, and yet he found time to devote attention to the intellectual legacy that we were both discussing. And so you'll see the way that I've edited these dialogues. They cover a number of different topics from his biography and formation. I was very interested in, how somebody from rural southern Tunisia becomes an intellectual. What were his sources of thought? Much of this is known in the public sphere, but hearing him talk about it and pressing him on certain issues was important. We talked about the themes of democracy, sovereignty, and morality. Again, the universal khilafa, democracy, and the meaning of the Sharia. And finally, freedom, pluralism, and toleration. And so there were many areas. As an academic and a political theorist, you're always interested in the problems of a particular body of thought. What are its gaps? What are its questions? What are the points that you'd like to see clarified? So it's never simply explain more, but it's do you see certain kinds of areas that are underexplicated or need to be developed? And so we spent a lot of time talking on those kinds of issues, and it was quite explicit that it was comparative. His thinking about democracy is extremely sophisticated and refers to democratic theory as developed in France and the United States and in the Soviet Union. And so he's grappling with problems that political theorists from outside the Islamic world have grappled with. And so that was a very, very great honor to, as a political philosopher myself, engage in this dialogue with him and try to see where his own thought was developing and what he thought. And I can only thank him for his generosity and his willingness to engage in this. And it's my hope, not only that this is a contribution to the Islamic public sphere and understanding of his thought and understanding of thinking about Islam and democracy more generally, but also that our dialogues will become part of his canon. That people will look to this to help understand better his thinking when pressed on certain kinds of issues, and that it'll be part of sort of the modern library of his thought and Islamic political thought more generally. Now, I don't know how long you want me to speak. It's very important with academics to be very clear about this. What I usually do from here is I say, so let me, can I see that book? So this is the English translation of Public Freedoms in the Islamic State. And you see it's an enormous book. It's extremely sophisticated. It's a very dense academic tome that, perhaps Muaz can attest, was written in many cases while in hiding. So it was supposed to be a PhD thesis, but he said that he finished it, وَأَنَا مُخْتَفِي was how he put it to me, in Algeria and perhaps back here in London. And so what I usually do is I usually say what my interpretation of this body of thought is. I'm going to try to be brief about that because nobody wants to hear an academic lecture on these sorts of things. But I think there's a few things that need to be established to understand the significance of this turn to Muslim democracy. So, as I've said, I think it'll be familiar to many people here that the core concept around which much, if not all, modern Islamic thought from the 1920s perhaps to the present, revolved was around the concept of sovereignty. So, of course, as we all know, you have thinkers like Maududi and others from the 1920s and 30s saying that the central feature of Islamic political thought is the idea of divine sovereignty, or hakimiyatullah. The idea that God is sovereign and that what it means to be divine, one of the attributes of Godhead is giving law. And so if you are claiming the right to give law, you are claiming certain aspects of divinity, which of course is a kind of blasphemy or kufr. So the concept of sovereignty has been central to Islamic political thought at least since the 1920s or 30s. Now, you have the question of what does it actually mean in practice for sovereignty to be executed? You may believe that God acts in the world and is causing events in the world, but most people don't believe that God is sitting behind a desk issuing judgments as a qadi, or issuing edicts as a ruler, or as a parliamentarian. So these questions about how God's sovereignty is executed. And a very interesting feature is that it's actually Maududi himself that introduces the idea of the ummah and the people as God's khalifa. This is not a later modernist liberal invention. It is something that Maududi himself puts into the intellectual bloodstream. So from the beginning of what we might call modern Islamic or Islamist political thought, you have these two concepts. God is sovereign, but the people, not the ruler, not the sultan, not the general, and not even the scholars of the ulama, has received the obligation to bring about a divine order. So from the beginning, Maududi himself, I'm sure many of you know, refers to his own ideal as a kind of theo-democracy. So this concept of sovereignty is guiding Islamist thought throughout the 20th and 21st century. I don't want to get too technical on what the concept of sovereignty is. We can maybe do that during the break. But what I want to stress here is that by the writing of Ghannouchi, particularly in this book, my claim is that Ghannouchi had developed the most comprehensive, most sophisticated theory of how a regime or a society or a state can uphold in equal measure both divine and popular sovereignty. And the theological claim is this concept of the people as God's caliph. And that's extremely important because there are many concepts that are derived from fiqh that many Sunni thinkers have tried to stretch into a concept of constitutionalism or democracy. Things like shura, things like the election of the ruler as opposed to divine designation, things like the bay'ah, things like the constitutional tradition in which the ruler has rights and responsibilities but limited authority. But these are all juridical concepts that can only go so far. By making central the theological idea that the people is God's caliph, you have a much more robust and comprehensive theory of why the people is the source of Islamic virtue, Islamic power, Islamic morality, and Islamic normativity. The second point is that while Ghannouchi was a democratic theorist, through this book, he was not a liberal theorist. He was not, in fact, the book is so fascinating, and I love teaching it to students in America because it begins with a critique of Western democracy. Like in Britain, like in France, by saying there are many mechanisms of democracy that are great, but there's no underlying foundation that guarantees that they be put to a moral purpose. And so the problem of Islamic political thought is how can you say that these mechanisms are valuable? We can have elections, freedom of the press, rule of law, freedom of assembly, separation of powers, unions, things like this. But underlying that is a deep moral foundation. So the theory is a phrase that we political philosophers like to use, perfectionist. It says that the purpose of politics is to make humans the best that they can be. And this is a direct quote from a number of his works. The purpose of politics is to create the conditions for people to live in innate accord, tawafuq fitri, with divine law. So politics is not just about peace or separation of powers or managing conflict or the IMF or or corona or anything like that. It's about making humans as good as they can be. Third, there is a robust place for the idea of divine sovereignty in the divine law. Fourth, the central assumption, here's where it differs from lots of traditional Western Republican and liberal democratic thought. The fundamental assumption of public freedoms in the Islamic State is a kind of moral unity. The assumption that the people who is ruling is a Muslim people. It's a pious people. It's a people that sees itself as God's Khalifa on earth, and so therefore agrees that political action should be harmonized in a kind of unity towards shared moral purposes. And so, yes, there's separation of powers, there's pluralism, but those are all put in the service of a kind of moral unity. And there's fascinating discussions of Western political thinkers like Montesquieu and James Madison, where he says that's good for them, because those poor modern Westerners no longer have unity about their moral purposes. But alhamdulillah, we still do, so we can assume that politics is about unity. And that's a very important shift to what happens after. Fifth, the people is the source of all political authorities. The people can create new institutions, and there's popular participation in lawmaking, including in the making of the Sharia. Now, here is Sheikh. I'm going to skip over some of these things. We all know then what happens. There are radical democratic elections in Tunisia in 2011 to the Constituent Assembly, perhaps one of the most radically democratic experiments ever. There was no Egyptian army hanging over. There was no occupying American troops. It was just the Tunisians and their own political forces. I don't need to repeat what kind of political system came out of that. Now, here's where you start to see the shift. So note these two quotes with the time that I have left. In 2012, Sheikh is still saying that the state loses its legitimacy and right to obedience to the extent that it departs from the law, that is the Sharia. 1 year later, in Islam, there is no church that can monopolize the interpretation of Islam, but this is left rather to the Ummah and the people through its institutions. And so when we discovered that the question of Sharia was raised, we found it to be a subject of ikhtilaf or disagreement. But constitutions are not adopted on the basis of what there is disagreement around, but rather what is agreed upon. And so you see this shift to saying we need to take the reality of politics seriously. So if this previous set is my characterization of Islamic democracy, on my reading, the idea of Muslim democracy is the following. One, politics is not about making us perfect, but is about a contract around mostly worldly goods, things that we all have in common in the dunya. We have to take the existing range of pluralism as a fact. There are radical secularists. There are unionists. There are nationalists. There are feminists. There are communists. There are perhaps radical Salafis. There are people that have fundamental disagreements about politics, but if you want a political order that's not based on authoritarianism or civil war, you have to deal with the actually existing range of pluralism and not your ideal range of pluralism. And so agreement and consensus is the primary task of politics. The Islamic Sharia becomes a matter of whatever prevents tyranny and limits government. And the overarching theme that is repeatedly brought up is the Wathiqat al-Medina, the Covenant of Medina, that the Prophet made an agreement with many tribes that were not Muslim, and this agreement was pluralistic and it was about worldly goods. And if it was good enough for the Prophet, why is it not good enough for us in Tunisia today? And at one point in one of his essays that's translated, Sheikh says, we Muslims are lucky that our first state was a pluralist state. And so there's some quotes that we can look at later. I want to conclude here, which these are some political theory questions that may not resonate with you. Perhaps you can speak back and say, what does this turn to Muslim democracy signify for you? But there's a number of ways of thinking about this from a political theory perspective, that it's an attempt to arrive at a kind of constitutional consensus that's not really based on a deep metaphysical agreement. Sheikh once said to me that we support the Constitution, but الدستور غير مقدس. The Constitution is not sacred. It could be revised. It's as good as it is as long as it works. So we could perhaps understand this as a matter of non-ideal theory. This is ideal theory, when you have the conditions that you want. This is when you have to deal with conditions that are maybe not the ones that you would prefer. Some people say that Muslim democracy should not be taken that seriously. It's just rhetoric. It's just something to tell the French, ease up, you don't need to be scared of us, let us continue to operate in politics, and to tell other Tunisian political actors, like Nidet Tunis and others that were very hostile to Ennahda, that we are signaling to you that we have adopted a different branding or ideology. We're not trying to monopolize power. But in my view, I think what's very significant historically is, as I began, the concept of sovereignty dominated Islamic political thought for most of modernity. In this Muslim democratic writings, the concept of sovereignty goes away. There isn't this obsession with saying, who is the sovereign agent? Is it God? Is it the people? And to what extent can the people speak in a unified way? Rather, it begins with a different set of realities about how politics actually operates, dealing with political evil as opposed to political ideals. And so it doesn't assume that politics flows from a single sovereign voice, even if it's the people as God's caliph. But it's not merely moderate, or it's not merely secular. It preserves the idea that politics is still about competition and conflict. It's still a space to pursue your own aims, but you pursue them democratically. You pursue them while recognizing others as legitimate actors, not to be eradicated. And so in my view, this last concept is one that I'd like to suggest, that this turn to Muslim democracy represents a historic moment in Islamic political thought, that it's post-sovereigntist and it's agonistic. It sees politics not as a space where everything flows from morality, but things flow from a kind of political struggle contained by democratic recognition. Now, people can tell me why I got it all wrong. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Truly fascinating and thought-provoking. The good thing about it is that I presume we have copies of the books here tonight.
I don't know. Some people do.
In any case, you would be strongly advised, to get copies of both books to further understand how this transition, essentially what he's speaking about is this transition from being an Islamist movement or party into something called Muslim democracy, Muslim Democrats. So I go to our second speaker, Dr. Galul, and he will speak for 10 minutes about his own experiences in Tunis as a practitioner, trying to implement the thoughts and policies of Sheikh Rashid.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Andrew. I have a special request for you tonight. And this is a letter from Sheikh Rashid from his prison.
Oh, wow.
I don't know whether So I said this is a letter from Sheikh Rashid to this gathering from his prison. Right now Sheikh Rashid is in a Hamish trial. Well, as a student of Sheikh Rashid since now more than 30 years, since 1994, I had to ask him this question, whether the concept of democracy, Muslim Democrats, is still valid within the context through which we are going through, especially with what is happening in Palestine, and especially that he, the person, the main character in the Muslim Ummah, who is advocating this idea, he's in prison right now. He's the one who's called for all these values of consensus, democracy, justice, tolerance, and now at the age of 83 or 81, was it? 82. That's from March, so we trust me. Don't trust me. At the age of 82, he's in prison. I mean, with what is happening right now, a testimony against his ideas and against his values. So this is his answer. I am in prison today because I called for the values of national democracy, which is part of universal democracy. And because the conflict in Tunisia is a conflict between democracy and non-democracy. Some of the enemies of democracy rely on modernity as a bias to exclude Islamic opponents. We in Tunisia, we are founded on the values of Islam. And we do not find any justification to exclude those who disagree with us or those who believe in Islam with a different vision. Because we do not see that there is an official spokesman for Islam. I am in prison today because a significant portion of the so-called Tunisian modernists are non-democratic. They call for a democracy that is just for them, an exclusionary democracy, whereas we are in struggle for a Tunisia for all and for a democracy that includes everyone inside Tunisia and outside Tunisia. The country today is governed by a dualism of good and evil, right and wrong, patriotism and treason. This is the essence of the coup of the 25th of July 2021. The monopoly of patriotism, the monopoly of Islam, and the monopoly of righteousness. Therefore, the existing regime is in a relentless war against democracy in all its meanings. This approach cannot bring Tunisians together because God created people different. The current system sees difference as a curse, but we see it as a mercy. Palestine exposed the shortcoming of democracy within the framework of nation-state. Democracy as a mechanism is one of the best mechanisms that the human political mind has produced for consensus and reaching settlement between differences and a way to resolve disputes away from violence. But when democracy is confined to a particular group and is imprisoned within the trench of nationalism, race, and color, its mechanism break down in more than one case, especially in the face of major challenges, such as the Palestinian question. The flaw, then, is not in the idea of democracy, but in the idea of a nation-state outside the framework of ethics and the values of equality for all human beings. There is no framework for ethics outside the framework of man as God Khalifa or vicegerent on earth. The one who is entrusted to look after this world, he's the one who is entrusted to look after this world. Therefore, we demand democracy and add to it our understanding of Islam so that it emerges from the confines of the narrowness of the individual and the group to the vastness of humanity. Sheikh Rashid, as Andrew has mentioned in his book, has to criticize the concept of democracy, especially when it is related to the concept of nation state. Now, Sheikh Rashid conceived and considers, and right now he's in his 3rd month fasting since the starting of Tufan al-Aqsa. He's fasting every day up to today. He stopped for only 2 or 3 days when there was a truce. The Palestinian case is the case that is central for him, where he is right now in prison. The issue of freedom is central to Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi. But how Islamic, one could question, how Islamic are the thoughts of Sheikh Rashid? I mean, Andrew spoke about a shift. Let me go back to a scholar who is also from the ruler south of Tunisia. And this scholar used to be Imam al-A'zam of Jama' al-Azhar, the dean, if you could say, of al-Azhar. He's Tunisian, actually. His name is Al-Khadr Hussein. He's had a very good but small book. The book is entitled Al-Hurriya fil Islam. In that book, there is a small chapter which is called Al-Hurriya, Al-Hurriya Dini. What he says here, freedom in Al-Hurriya fil Din. I will not translate the term Din here as religion. Because if you read Ibn Ashur and you read Al-Khadr Hussein, the term religion might be used in Arabic as the term Diyana rather than Deen. As for the term Deen, it encompasses the concept of Diyana, but mainly the jurisprudence, the concept of Sharia. So what Khadr Hussein says, Islam has decided in dealing with nations under its protections to guarantee them rights that ensure their freedom in their religion, Diyana, the space in enacting their laws among themselves, and the establishment of their rituals with autonomous will. There is no way for those in authority to hinder any of their rituals, and there is no entry for the judicial authority to intervene in resolving their private matters unless they willingly agree to be judged before it. And he goes on explaining this idea and providing adilla for this concept. Let me also refer to when Sheikh Rashid speaks about implementing Sharia, the main maqsad of Sharia, that is Hifdhuddin, isn't it? So you have Hifdhuddin. When we speak, how Ibn Ashur would explain Hifdhuddin. He says, Ibn Ashur, I'm finishing in short, once we examine the resources of Islamic law, the concept of Hifdhuddin meaning preserving the social system, Hifdhu Nizam al-Ummah. So, and we can go, I can bring more arguments, and I will go back to Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim to find foundations for all what Sheikh Rashid is saying in both of his books, actually. And the originality of Sheikh Rashid is that he is well entrenched in Islam, and he was really able, and he fought very hard to implement those values, and he made the proof that those values are valid for the practice. Now let me finish with this. When the coup happened on the 26th, after one day of the coup, he's asked everybody, just go home. We are not going to get into any type of bloodshed. He says the line of revolution, it goes up and down, but it will recover. So he's quite confident that this is a historical process, it's not going to stop. The most important thing in this process is that we stick by our values. That is why from the first day when the case of Tufel Aqsa started for Sheikh Rashid, it was an opportunity for Muslim Democrat and for these values, for these universal values who outbound the boundaries of the concept of nation state, in regard to that a nation state restricts the concept of interest within those borders. However, if we go back to Shatibi, even furthermore, we will understand the concept of maslaha in Sharia. And it is all based on the issue of freedom. Shatibi says, المقصد الأعلى للشريعة, I will say it in Arabic translated, هو أن نعبد الله اختيارا كما نعبده اضطرارا, that we worship Allah, that we freely worship Allah, as we are His creatures by necessity. So, And this is, I mean, I will not, because of time, go further, but I personally, in my personal relationship with Sheikh Rashid, I insist that we are not facing a state of a victim, even though he's in prison. We cannot deal with this state as someone who is a victim of oppression. He is someone who believes in these values, who believes that these values are universal, who believes on the issue of freedom, justice for all mankind, independently of their beliefs, whether they are Muslims or non-Muslims. And he believes that he has to stand by and keep believing in those ideas. After that, it is a process of history which will really bring about results.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. I really want to save as much time for you, the audience, to engage both speakers. But before we do that, we just want to give Muaz, son of Sheikh Rashid, a couple minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, to convey sentiments from his dad.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I don't have much to add to what Professor Andrew and Brother Ahmed have said. We're 3 weeks away from Ramadan, and last Ramadan, so that's nearly 11 months ago, on the night of the 27th, which is one of the most blessed nights on the month. The whole month is blessed, obviously, but the night of the 27th is one of the most blessed. 100 policemen raided our house in Tunisia and took my father away. His crime was that he was calling for democracy and he was criticizing the dictatorship that President Said was trying to build. Today is 309 days since he was taken away, and there's already around 10 cases pending against him, with all accusations under the sun. Many of you know Sheikh Rashid, my father. He used to visit this blessed center and used to deliver talks here and in many other places. So he was a member of the British Muslim community, and I'd like to ask you all as leaders of the British Muslim community, as members of the British Muslim community, to, inshallah, I know everyone is busy with Gaza and with what's happening all around the Muslim world, but I hope, inshallah, that you can remember what's happening in Tunisia, you can remember my father, Sheikh Rashid, that you can help us, inshallah, in putting pressure on the Tunisian government, inshallah, to release him and the many other political prisoners. And this pressure can be done through many ways, through the local MP, through writing to the Tunisian embassy here, writing to the foreign office here, petitions, articles, many things that can be done. And inshallah, with your efforts, inshallah, and the efforts of many other people, we can, inshallah, put pressure so that Sheikh Rashid is released, and that hopefully, inshallah, democracy is back in Tunisia. As Brother Ahmed said, you know, the process of change doesn't go like in one line, it goes up and down. Unfortunately, you know, what happened back in Egypt in 2013 caught up with us in Tunisia. We held out for, you know, a few more years, but the conspiracies continued, and unfortunately they managed to bring democracy down. But inshallah, we're sure that our people, not just in Tunisia, but inshallah in Egypt and many other places, will inshallah work and struggle to bring freedom back. And inshallah, we ask inshallah Allah to bless our efforts, inshallah, to bring freedom back, and also ask Allah, inshallah, to help our brothers and sisters in Gaza, who we see every day are suffering, and but they're still standing and defending their right, inshallah, to be free. Jazakumullah khair.
Thank you, Mars. Now I would like to open the floor for questions or comments. Make it brief, please, so that everyone can have an opportunity. Yes, please at the back.
Assalamu alaikum. Core question lies in the fact that can you be truly Islamist and be a Democrat? Often when we talk about Sheikh Tanushi, there is a tendency to make him a post-Islamist. And in fact, when Azam Tamimi talks about Sheikh Ghanouchi, he calls him an Islamist, but a Democrat. And then also he mentioned about Maududi. Maulana Maududi and Jamaat Islami Hind failed to engage in the Indian democracy in a Nehruvian context up until the 70s. So the question lies, can you be truly Islamist and be a Democrat? Or do you have to sort of do some compensation and go to the post-Islamist domain and then can engage with democracy?
So my argument is very simple conceptually. What is the idea of democracy? That there's a demos, a people, a sha'ab, hukm sha'ab, that rules. Now if you're going to say the people rules, you have to have some understanding of what you think the people is, what its properties are, what its attributes are, what its capacities are, what its capabilities are. And that's what different political theories differ in. Now, there are theories of democracy that assume very little about the people. Whatever people you have, through accident or historical conquest or violence, that's the people that you have. And you assume that they're going to differ in their passions, their desires, their beliefs, their interests, their aims, their aspirations. And then you ask the question, can a people that differs this way govern itself without one faction trying to dominate the other? There's another conception of democracy, and you see this in figures like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and in the earlier version of Sheikh Rashid, which says that, what if you assume that the people has other properties, that most of them are united in their beliefs, united in their aspirations, united around a conception of morality and virtue, that most of them are good and want to act in a certain way. And then you say, can that people be described from an Islamic standpoint as having the right to govern itself? And so in my opinion, the fundamental difference is not about the attitude of Islam towards democracy. The fundamental question is, what are the assumptions that you're making about all of these qualities and attributes of the people? And there's one interesting thing that I'd like to point out, which is, many people in the West like to associate Islamism with revolutionary violence or militant violence or something like that. But even figures like Maududi and Qutb and others, their theory is grounded on an assumption of very deep consent by the people. The people is already Muslim. Is Sha'ab mutadayyin bit-taba'. The people has already consented to this because of their fitrah. This is what the people already wants. And so there's a sense in which much of this theory is based on these assumptions about what the people is. Now the question is, how do you explain why the people is not like that? Why were the Tunisian people so divided? Is it just because of colonialism? Is it just because of Bourguiba and Ben Ali? Is it just because of secular domination and ideology? Then you can say it doesn't matter what they think, eventually they'll all be Muslim again. Or do you say, well, wait a second, the world is complicated, and people use their minds and arrive at different conclusions, and we can't do anything about that peacefully. So that, in my opinion, is a very big question that is hard, I think, for a lot of Islamic thinkers to think about. Because then what you're fundamentally asking is, why aren't more Muslims Muslim? And is there any good reason for that, or are there only bad reasons for that we don't really need to take that seriously? Sure.
Let me take 3 questions, just to save you time. Take 3 questions. The speakers answer this one.
Do you think there's an analogy to be drawn between thinking about you think there's an analogy to be drawn between thinking about democracy as a basic foundational idea, if you like in the language of Islam, al-usul, versus thinking about democratic governance as a practical idea, more to do with the furu'. And so social contract inevitably leads to this notion that people are going to organize, as opposed to thinking about it in the way maybe early thinkers thought about it, if that makes sense.
Great question.
The other?
The shift from Islamic democracy to Muslim democracy seems to be based on pragmatism. And I'm wondering if, so that's a concession that pragmatism plays a role in our thinking about these sorts of things. But has that gone far enough? Because modern nation state, the state itself, has a specific history, and many would say the state is constructed in the service of capitalism, and in the context of the US, in the Middle East, in the context of US hegemony. So the idea of using the tools of the state to elevate the human being, in the way Rashid Ghanouchi says, is almost, again, very idealistic. It's not very practical in that sense. Your thoughts?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My thinking is this: are we not being intimidated by the domination of the ideal of democracy? Because I want to believe that monarchy or call it royalty were in existence during the period of the prophets and after during the period of the caliphate. But think of it, anybody who come out to talk about governance, how do you call it? Islamic democracy, Muslim democracy, people will rise up because they are afraid of Islamic system. So my question is this. I think the emphasis should be on the Maqasid al-Sharia. Maqasid al-Sharia spell out clearly the objective of the Islamic system. That is my belief. So I don't know whether we are not being intimidated by dominance of the world power. Thank you very much.
As connected to this previous question, actually, is it this particular thought, Islamic democracy to Muslim democracy, is it because of nowadays democracy is a concept or talk of the world by influential thought, or is it a independent thought?
Well, thank you very much. I've tried to, even it's a very short time, but I've tried to call the attention to how Islamic is the concept of Muslim democracy. And the idea is that it is Islamic. And as Ibn Ashur says in his book, Usul Nizam al-Ijtima'i fi Islam, the foundation of the social system in Islam, that democracy is Islamic, but the democracy in Islam is better in a way than modern democracy. Ibn Ashur wrote his book during the 1940s, okay? And he's Imam al-A'zam of Jama' al-Zaytuna, and he's the one who wrote At-Tahrir wa Tanweer, which is one of the best tafsir of Quran. And I've tried to call your attention that we can go back with the concept of al-aqdu bayna al-umma wal-hakim, which goes back to not only Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, but also to Al-Izz ibn Abd, not Al-Izz ibn yeah. So this idea of aqd, that there is an aqd between the ummah and al-hakim. So Ibn Ashur or Sheikh Rashid, they say democracy is a system. It is right now, as he said in his letter, which I've read to you, up to now this is the best what the mankind have created in a way of dealing with public affairs and dealing with conflicts. However, what's better with Muslim democracy is that it goes beyond the borders of a national state, nation state. And here we go back to the concept of maslaha in Islam, in contrast with the concept of interest or maslaha within the concept of nation state. This will bring us to a lot of discussion. It's not about intimidation. It's about our right as a human being and as Muslims, first of all, to be free and to have a say in our public affairs and to decide who governs us. It's not about that democracy is a creation of the West. Why not? But this is a good tool which, if we are allowed to live in a democratic world, then we will be better Muslims. And actually, when we implement democracy as we believe in it, our democracy, we think that it is better because it is more universal. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Rahmatan lil Alameen. I think if we dig into this concept, we will find out that actually this is more Islamic than what is thought. What is a non-democracy is closer to Islam because this term was not there. And it's not only about maqasid sharia, it's even about, if you read the Qawaid al-Fiqhiyya and Usul al-Fiqh, you will find these concepts. They are there. They've been there within our ummah. It's just that our generations, we've been cut from our inheritance. And we are reading Islam from the eyes and of modern time, that is nation state. So we need to bridge these gaps, and I think Sheikh Rashid Al-Ghannouchi is a big jump or big number of steps in this bridging with our inheritance.
Just had a question in terms of what exactly is the difference between Muslim democracy and, let's say, English democracy or American democracy, because without a doubt we can't ignore the contextual, contingent, circumstantial situations that has given rise to this kind of change in thinking or even development, which is fine. You know, it's within Sharia, you can say it's darura, this is the situation, this is the best you can do, it's pragmatic, it's realistic, etc. But in real terms, you know, isn't the English democracy or American democracy far more advanced in terms of, if it's just about everyone has a different conception of the good, the communists in Tunisia, the modernists, the secularists, the Islamists, all have different conceptions of the good. They may be united as an identity, Muslim identity, but their conception of the good is very different. So if it's just about how do we best resolve this competing idea of the good, and the best way is democracy, that's fine. The West is far more advanced in that, resolving conflict, allowing freedom of thought, pluralism, etc. So where's the difference? I'm just failing to see what the difference is between Muslim democracy, English democracy, or even French democracy.
Last one.
Assalamu alaikum. Just following on from the previous couple of questions, I was trying to understand in my mind how your understanding of Muslim democracy or Islamic democracy deals with some of the limitations of democracy that we see, and we see in the implementations around the world, where if a society itself is radicalized over a number of years or generations, then they will always vote for extremist and radicalized governments, or governments that want to push domestic and foreign policies along a particular track. So how does your understanding of Islamic democracy deal with those kinds of situations?
I don't know the gentleman's name here, but I want to agree with a lot of what you said and observed, because there is a very big difference between Islamic democracy and Western democracy. The original vision in an Islamic state. You're very right that what Muslim democracy is not a distinct system. It's a distinct attitude and rationalization for a system that looks much more like most parliamentary democracies. So in public freedoms in the Islamic State, Sheikh Rashid says, we're not just arguing for standard Western parliamentary democracy. And he has many fascinating critiques of it. But what comes out of the 2014 Constitution is very similar. The president is supposed to be Muslim, but who in Tunisia is not legally a Muslim? The state has an Arab Islamic identity, but that's not given any content in the Constitution. It's up to the people. So you're right. So what I would say is, what Muslim democracy is a Muslim or Islamic attitude towards this fact, also with the caveat that it understands politics not just as a one-time agreement about moderation and toleration and democracy, in which you then pursue your aims in the private sphere, but allows for ongoing competition and struggle in the public sphere. So if you had at some point 60-70% of the people voting for a religious party, it would not be constrained to not pursue aims or legislation in line with what that morality wants. So your observation is very perceptive, and I agree with it. But the only thing I want to say is there is something contingent about it. But is there? Is this the exception? Is it the exception that a given society has all of these various parties, or is that actually the norm? Is that actually how you ought to begin by seeing politics? As opposed to, well, in reality, everybody's supposed to be pious, but you have these contingent things because of Bourguiba and colonialism. Well, what if the other assumption were made? That this is the norm. Politics is about that kind of disagreement. Would Islamic political thinking have to begin from a different place?
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks to the MC. Thanks to all the organization and our speakers. See you another time.
Okay. Okay, that's yours. That's yours. You guys see you, sir? Say you're coming up. Beg your pardon? I think it's done. Thank you. I know. Yeah.
إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا
So my answer or Shifrash's? Well, he's very fond of saying that radicalism is a function of authoritarianism. Authoritarianism suppresses religious knowledge, suppresses civil society, suppresses tradition. So it won't be only they got these pathological expressions of it. That's democracy or civil freedom. The Muslims can be free to be persuasive again to prevent that kind of radicalization. So that's his kind of view. I'm not that.
وعدا عليه حقا في التوراة
He often says that Islamic radicalism disagrees with is caused by authoritarianism. Because they co-opted the Shuyukh or prevented Islamic knowledge, and only there were the radical Salafi jihadis that had that kind of legitimacy because of authoritarianism. I don't know if he's right or not, and I don't have